Right. We are going to dive into gradebook, or gradebook and Brightspace today. So you guys are going to get to see my summer course, which, in all vulnerability, it is not complete yet, though it is going to go live next week. So I have some time set aside to get this finished up. So this is my class, Women in Crime. It's launching next week, and you'll get to see how much further I have to do on this class. So
well, we can build some of it right now.
Yeah,
we're going to share my course, but I've already got 3 weeks of grades with about 16 grade items for students already there. So
we will probably see students' names here, but we won't see grades. I'm not sure how that's going to work with recording. Maybe we'll be able to.
Would that be for protected?
Would that be for protected? Anyone?
We can check on it. Anyone know?
Anyone know if that's
see a list of names of students in the class?
I feel like that is a purpose.
I think that's probably.
You think it's appropriate?
If not, we could edit the damn thing and grade it out.
We can figure it out. Okay.
We've done it before.
We're gonna give it a shot. So so to get to our grade book, like we've been sort of preaching to everyone in these sessions, we're going to start with course tools and go to course admin.
That is where you go for 99% of what you have to do in the course.
So under assessment, we see, assignments, competencies, quizzes, surveys, all of these things. So we're going to actually head over to grades, but just want to quickly note that when you do have items that need graded, you can jump over to quick eval, and you'll see all of the assignments that have yet to been evaluated.
And we're not going to be able to show that now, but it's really intuitive, and it's a nicer interface than Blackboard's. What we want to do for the first time, and Maggie has already done this, but we're going to do it anyway. It won't do any harm. We're going to go to the setup wizard, and unless you want to do it in another course.
No, we'll do it. Well, we could do it in a different course. We could do it in the course that I haven't done yet.
Okay, well, let's do it. We're going to work through a course that has not yet had a gradebook set up, because that's probably the first thing you should do in setting up your gradebook.
We'll do fall. So again, we're jumping into my fall semester course. So we're going to go grades. And first thing we're going to do is it's going to take us automatically to the setup wizard. Okay, so right now this is what our current gradebook settings are. So the grading system is on points. There's an automatic release of the final grade. So students will see that as grades are coming in. It's treating ungraded items as 0, automatically keeping final grades updated.
But it will ask us all these questions as we go through. So those are just where it started. And you can do this at any time if you want to revise your gradebook settings.
So we'll go ahead and click start at the bottom. And so again, if you are just joining us for this session and you're not logged into your Brightspace account, you can go to oswego.edu/mylearning. I'm sure if Casey is here, he'll drop it in the chat for us, as he's been doing. So, in the setup wizard, you select the grading system that you choose or that you are typically comfortable with. I am a weighted grade user, so I like to have things kind of proportional to that final grade. That's the view that I like to see. It's how I describe it in my syllabus. And so this is the grading system I tend to use. It's really not going to be much different than a point system. It's just preference.
The main advantage of a weighted grade system is you can let students see their current grade status as a percentage or as a letter grade at any point in the course. If you're using a point system, students won't really know where they stand until the very end of the semester. And by then it's kind of too late. But you can give them feedback regularly on where they are in terms of how many points they should have if they're making good progress towards, passing the course or whatever.
Yeah.
But if you use a weighted system, it's obvious. Now I have about 40 items in my graded categories, but under 5 or 6 categories.
Right. So,
but either one, whatever you normally do, you can use here.
Yeah, and these are probably the options that most people are going to use. I'm actually not very familiar with the formula option, but there's an ability to create a custom defined formula.
And we could click on it whenever you're in here and you're not sure of something, you could click on the question mark and it will give you some help on it.
Okay.
So it's a conditional grading system.
Yeah.
This is often used, for example, if you're doing some type of a contract grading system with some minimum specifications. Josh Eiler, for example, uses an ungraded system. But in order to be able to get a grade above a C, you have to have completed a certain number of prerequisites. Or you could do this, for example, if you're doing a specifications grading system where you have to meet a certain threshold to get an A, B, or C. And it could be just the number of assignments that you have passed that would determine the grade. So you can use formulas here. It's probably not very common. And certainly anyone who uses Blackboard would not be starting with this. So you're probably going to use either points, if that's what you've been doing, or using a percentage system, which is the weighted system.
All right, so you go ahead and hit continue. Okay, the final grade released is the next item. I usually do a calculated final grade. This, second option is, to your preference, whether you want the ability to modify or adjust the user's grade before you release them. I like to let students know where they stand in the course at every moment that they're in the course. So if it's week 2, they know what grades they've submitted and where that final grade is standing. And it's particularly helpful, I think, when you do have assignments that are weighted differently, so that when students, realize that, there's still, 40% of my grade that hasn't been entered yet. So, it does kind of give them a better metric of where they're at in that. So, and
there's also a lot of research that shows that the Dunning-Kruger effect is real, that students who are struggling always they stand in the course. So that students who are failing the class, who might have a 20% average, if they don't get to see that explicitly in the gradebook, will assume they're doing okay, or they'll be able to recover later without changing their practices. So letting students know where they stand all the time is really important. Letting them know that they need to work a bit more, they need to start completing things is really important. And one of the problems with a points-based system or not sharing their grade status is that it's much easier to ignore information that's not there.
So whatever your preference is, you can go ahead and hit continue. You can also use this navigation to go back and change anything that you like.
Have it in as or you're using a
Is
it showing out of the total points though?
Yes.
So
they could calculate it theoretically, right? Calculate what their percentage grade is. I think for the most part, students are familiar what an 80% looks like and what an 85% looks like. So they could use the point system to calculate that out for themselves. It's, just, it's a little.
If they don't see where will be an A, not realizing that if that oh no, this is on this works. Oh, okay.
They're saying that you're cutting out.
Okay.
A little bit. So hopefully that's a little bit better. So, you know, the feedback John was just giving was, you know, that giving students kind of that, you know, more information that's easily digestible about their grades is, you know, good practice for helping them when they are, you know, falling behind and such. Okay, is everyone still hearing us okay?
Yeah, it's an omnidirectional mic, but I was facing away, so that was the problem.
All right, so you can go ahead and hit continue. Great. Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so here you can decide if you want to drop ungraded items or if you want to treat ungraded items as a 0. I typically don't put ungraded items as a 0 into the course. That, you know, tends to make students feel like they're doing a lot worse in class when in fact things just have not yet been graded. So I do, again, also automatically keep that final grade updated as grades start to come in, so that will shift and change as their work is submitted.
Now, one thing though, with that ungraded items, there's a couple of things we should be careful with. One is that if there's work that they should have completed but have not, it will not count that towards a grade. So if you have, say, 14 weekly quizzes and they complete the first one and get an A, that will appear to be an A average in that category unless you treat the ungraded items as 0. So what you may want to do is put in 0s for any of the missing grades that was supposed to have been completed, because otherwise students' grades will not reflect where they actually stand. So you have to be careful to 0 fill missing scores and so forth.
Does it treat ungraded items that aren't due yet? That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about like.
Well, if we click on that, we can find out more, because that was a difference between, see,
items that do not have grades inputted are counted as 0 in the final grade. So,
well, for example, in my large class, when I do daily quizzes with clickers, you know, if I had, say, 400 students in the class, there will often be 10 to 40 students or 10 to 50 students who may not be there. And those scores will come in. Well, actually, iClicker now has the option to automatically upgrade 0s for missing scores. But if there's a quiz in here that they're supposed to do before each class, let's say, which I've sometimes done, I would have to manually go in and fill 0s with any of those unless I treat ungraded items as 0. So in general, if you choose to drop ungraded items, you have to be careful to put in 0s for them to show up as part of the average. And when you have hundreds of students, that could be a fair amount of work. So I normally treat ungraded items as 0, but I don't put items into the gradebook category until they are due. And then if I allow them to still complete them, with many things I do, then it will just override the 0 when they retake it again, if you allow multiple attempts or attempts past the due date.
Yeah, and I'll say that this particular class is going to be capped at a certain number of students because it's a writing intensive course. And so for me, it's not hard to, you know, jump in and add 0s when students haven't completed the work. You know, it's not hundreds of students. So, you know, certainly think about what suits your particular class best.
But there were some questions in the chat, and let's get, because one of them, actually, I'm not sure, the primary and secondary grade feed are similar to Blackboard. Oh, yes, you can display grade options, but you can actually, I believe you now have the choice of displaying any 2. So you could display a letter grade and a percentage or a score or any, I believe it's 2 out of the 3, but I'm not positive.
So Casey mentioned you can manually enter in 0s for missing assignments. The big reason not to is that any assignments open will start with a 0 grade.
Now, a way of doing that is I have a category in Blackboard. I had a category called not yet included in the grade, and then I would transfer that over at the due date so it would become counted. So, you know, you can still have everything set up as long as the additional scores are not added to one of your gradebook categories. So there are ways of doing it in either case.
So we'll go ahead and hit continue, and it's going to take us to the next step. So this is the grading scheme, right? So, you know, what percentages you want to That's the word I'm looking for.
Grade schemas. These are the grade schemas that we have in Blackboard, where you set letter grades with certain thresholds.
Letter grades, that's what I'm looking for. And like the A's and the B's. And yeah, so, you know, you can kind of take a look at these. This isn't, you know, necessarily the grade schema. This is a demo grade scheme. And
it is actually also the default one. You can create your own. One of the things that people didn't realize is that when some institutions have grade systems for the entire college, and that's true at GCC and Suffolk and whatever else SUL-SCC is, where there's different thresholds for different letter grades. But you can create your own just as you could in Blackboard individually.
This is GCC's grade scheme. So a 60 will you know, result in a D minus, right? 70, a C minus, etc. Okay, so right now, you know, what we decide as default, we'll carry on. I'm just going to keep percentage here. You know, I can always go back and change this.
You know, I'm not seeing the ability to change. You should have that ability, but
I mean, you can. Oh, I see what you mean. You can't like add.
Well, we may have the ability to do it extra. This is if you're using a standard one, but there is still the capability of adding, I'm sure.
Yeah. It's a number of decimals, places to display, so you can kind of decide what best suits you for that.
And this is where you choose what students will see. And this is a wonderful option, what Maggie is now checking. So you could choose actually display, I guess, all three of them if you want, so students can see all three. The number of points they got, the percent grade, the letter symbol. But that grade scheme color is really, really helpful, because that way, based on the schema you use, it will show students that are doing well, that are in trouble, and that are poor. And yes, you could use a point scale too. So because we chose a percentage, these are the questions you get based on that earlier question. And if you don't like it, by the way, you can always go back and redo it. So if you decide you want to switch from percentage to points, you can do that at any point. But that's something you probably want to define initially, because once students are told how they're going to be graded, you want to stick with that.
Yeah. And so you know, again, because I use a weighted scale for my grades, I typically don't let students see the points grade, because I don't have enough energy to explain the points to them. But
although a nice thing about the points is if they have a 5-point assignment, they get to see. But if they see the percentage, they can go back and forth between it.
Yeah. So it's, you know, to each his own on this. So, you know, number of characters to display for text items. So I assume this is relative to the titles of assignments.
Titles or descriptions.
And number of decimals. Again, I always let students see what their final grade calculation is, or what that final grade calculation will look like. So go ahead. This is just a summary of all of the selections that I made. And so I'll go ahead and click finish. Now ready, right? To
and now here is the new grade scheme. Okay. So that's where you would set your thresholds for an A, a B, a C, a D, a C minus, A minus, etc.
Right. Any questions about the setup so far? I think it's a really nice tool to take you step by step through all of the decision making that you need to just kind of generally get the gradebook set up.
Enter grades, manage grades, manage grades.
So if there's not any questions, I suppose we can, you know, check out some of these other views. Okay, can we see what students see with the gradebook? Yeah.
Sort of. Once you set it up, you can go into a student view, but the student view, just as in Blackboard, is not exactly the same as the instructor view. But you would go into, if you want to see a student view, you would click on your name there and choose View as Oswego Student.
That's actually going to bring me back to the top of the course. You know, so I think I can.
But there won't be anything in there right now because there are no grades.
Yeah. Okay, so my performance. So go into grades and there's probably nothing there, right? Because literally this is the first time I've jumped into this course, so I've not created anything in here.
To see it as a student, you would have to take some of the quizzes, assessments, and so forth, grade yourself, and then view it. And I'm not sure how persistent that view is. I have heard that it is not. The one thing that we can't really see as students do is a gradebook, which is also true in Blackboard, that the view of, we couldn't see what students got to see with rubrics and other things, which is really unfortunate. But we can experiment with that more later. You still have to do a separate step unless there's some progress. The question, yeah. Question is, can midterm and final grades be transferred into My Oswego directly? Basically, no, because the campus had long had a policy of not doing that, even though it would have made things so much easier. Maybe that will change because this is, you know, there's a different integration with Banner. Many of us have, at least for the last couple of decades, been trying to encourage our campus to do that, as many other campuses have, where you just click publish the midterm grade or publish a final grade. But one way around that is you could export the grades into a spreadsheet, then upload the spreadsheet using the student IDs in order to get your grades in. So there are workarounds. We haven't tried that yet because we haven't gotten to the midterm or the final, but you do have the ability to export the grades, I'm almost certain, in a similar way.
So, you know, we already, again, just set up this, you know, through the setup wizard, but you can always go back to this tab and start it over again. So if you have changes you want to make, but, you know, that's the easy way to do it. So, and then here's schemes. You can create a new scheme here. You can delete schemes. I don't know if any of these can actually be deleted though.
No, because these
are entered in, I think.
They were administrators who did that. And these were done by people who did not realize that they would be visible by all SUNY. And they shut that down once people started doing it for their institutions. So. But
we can kind of look into their.
You could see the threshold, because some campuses do have policies that this range of grades will be in A, this range of grades will be in A-, and so forth.
Is Oswego not one of those?
Oswego is not one of those. Everyone gets to assign grades as they would like to.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, I always followed the same schema that GCC. You can add your schema.
Well, we know the person who created that was Judy.
And here's, you know, where you can kind of, you know, this manage grade tab, you know, allows you to kind of bulk edit. So if you had assignments in here, which I don't have, I can drop a couple in quickly to.
Maybe what we could do is new categories.
Sure.
And then show how you would compute the grade, because what happens is, just as in Blackboard or Angel before that, you create gradebook categories, which are the buckets in which all similar items go. And then you attach the percentages of those in computing the final grade.
So I do annotations in my class typically. I'm going to just keep the same short name. So this is in a new category now. So I selected the new option, clicked new category. So I'm going to go ahead and start going through each of these. I can add a description. These are grades related to the annotations on our course readings. I can allow the viewers to view this description, right? I can give
this would be whatever percentage of your grade is determined by the annotations.
So I tend to make it pretty low stakes. So, you know, 5 or 10% of the grade. I can distribute the weights across, you know, all items in the category. I tend to distribute the weight evenly across all items. So as not to make one reading assignments, annotations more than another.
And yeah, the other options would be if you want something to be worked twice as much as the others, you could do one of the first two where you assign the weight for each item. You know, if something is 10% of the category and something else is 20%, you can do that, or you could automatically do it based on the number of points in the item. So for example, for people using clickers, some days they might ask 5 questions, other days they might ask 10. And what would happen is if you want the days when there were 10 questions to count twice as much as the days when there were 5, you would use that second item. If you want each day to count the same in terms of the percent correct, then you would use a distribute weight evenly. And that's what I do for most of those things.
So there's a question in the chat. Is this only when using weighted grades? If you are just using point system, do you need to assign weights?
You would not need to assign weights because the weights would be the points.
So then once I've made that distribution selection,
So the question is, do you want to let the category grade to exceed the category weight? You probably don't.
Yeah, I
don't
see where you would want. There's options for people. You know, I do tend to let students see averages, you know, of the class.
For the items in the category.
For the items in the category. Override display options. So, you know, these are the display options that I set up in the setup wizard. If I want to override for this particular item and show them the points grade, I could. I'll go ahead and uncheck that because I'm happy with the selections that I made here. But you know, if you didn't want the entire gradebook to show the grade scheme color, right, but you wanted all of the items in this particular category to show the grade scheme color, you could, you know, select it here and unselect it in other places and kind of decide.
But it's a nice default to let students see it, and you can set it up so you can see it or they can see it or both when we get to further display. In general, it's a nice visual display for me because if I see red going all the way across a student's grades, that's a sign that that's a student you may want to reach out to. If you see green all the way across, and that student's doing pretty well and they get to see it, you get to see it. If it's yellow on some items, or you know, you get to see where they stand. There is some questions on why you might want to allow points to exceed that.
Okay, so Dennis asked, I want to add new categories tied to the gradebook. So how do I change the imported category names from Blackboard to adhere to these new categories?
A lot of this is one area where most of the connections break down. So in general, you will have to set this up directly in here, because while all the items will come across, all the assessments, all of the assignments and so forth, they will not automatically be connected to the gradebook. In general, in Blackboard, when you create a graded item, that will automatically appear. In Brightspace, what happens is you have to connect the things to that. So there was also a suggestion here that if you want to allow the points to exceed the weight of the category to allow students to get more points than the category allows, that provides for extra credit that could be allowed in others. That I haven't tried, but.
Yeah, I don't do extra credit in my class. So I do allow for like revise and resubmits of previous work, but yeah, that makes sense is why you would want to do that. And so, you know, if the categories are imported from Blackboard, Casey writes, in DLE, you can go to manage grades and click on the drop-down menu beside the category and see the list and edit. If you replace the lowest test grade and final exam grade, is there, with the final exam grade, is there any way to do that here?
I think that would require that custom grade thing where, and I'm not sure, I haven't tried that.
Where that formula.
What I have always done, I've done the same sort of thing where I've replaced other grades if they do better on a progressively cumulative score. What I've done is basically look through the grade book, compare the grades and type them in, which doesn't always scale well when you have 400 students, but there may well be a capability for that. I haven't done it yet.
I imagine if you're creating a custom formula, there's probably a way to do that for your final course grade.
Well, you know, one way of doing it is if you have lower grades you're going to replace, I think you could create a new category that, well, I think things can only be explained. I was going to say you could create a new category, which would be the sum, which would involve the two, and then use whichever is higher, but I don't know.
So in this particular class, I'm thinking about dropping my big paper project with an essay project. And so that is a, you know, you can certainly check out the recording that Jessamine Newhouse out of SUNY Plattsburgh did for us during our spring breakouts on alternative grading or an alternative assessment practice called the unessay. So this would be a scaffolded assignment. And so unlike the annotations where I would have all of the annotations weighted equally within the category, this I would not. I would have, you know, scaffolded assignments where some assignments were built on others. So some are weighted, you know, more than some of the items within that category will be weighted heavier than others. And so here I would pick, I would ask to manually assign weight to items in the category. So I'm gonna keep that option there. So I'm gonna save and close. So now I have two categories created in my gradebook here.
And it's over, you have 100 and, oh no, that's weight.
Yeah, these are weights. So I only have 55%
Okay.
of the grade, you know, in the course right now, right? It's not 100. This is the same kind of warning that comes up in Blackboard when you don't have everything equal to 100%. So, and, you know, within policy on essay, that's also, you know, not, you know, there's not a number of assignments within here yet. So to do
that didn't show up in the other category because it was treating each item equally in the overall category score. So once you get one in there, it will be 100%, then 50% when you add a second and so forth.
Okay, and I want to make a note here that there are many different ways you can link assignments and quizzes to the gradebook. You can do that when you are creating an assignment itself. So within that assignment page, which we talked about that in the last session, you can also create those items here and then link it to an exit. And then when you're creating the actual assignment drop box or, you know, drop submission link, you can link that to something you've already created. So if you know, there's lots of ways you can get your assessments linked to the gradebook. You just have to kind of decide what fits you and what the easiest way is for you. So
if you're going to do two policy on essays, you can create the items now without creating the actual assignment until later. And then you just link that to that gradebook item.
So I'll show you how that looks here. So,
but before we go, if you notice, this answers, I think, that earlier question that Zoe raised. You can automatically grade users using a custom formula based on achievement on other grade items.
okay.
So what you could do then is you could use your formula to create a final grade that would be perhaps a maximum of 2 different gradebook scores, perhaps. Maybe, but it looks like that might work.
So I'm going to select, trying to decide which ones to select. Actually, I'm going to do a pass fail right now. And this is just going to be the topic, right? So do they submit a topic? If they don't submit the topic, I'll go in and add a 0 since I don't have zeros automatically populating my my grade book. So this will be a topic, maximum points. I suppose, you know, 10 is fine. This is going to be just 5% of that unessay category.
And the bonus is where you would do extra credit if you're going to do that.
So you can add that if you like, or you can, you know, if I allowed for a if I did allow for an extra credit assignment within this category, I could make this particular assignment bonus, right, on top of, you know, the category. So this is one way of many ways that you can create rubrics. So you can create it in a new window, and then you can add an associated rubric. I don't have any associated rubrics in here. So, you know, just to know that there are many different ways to get at a lot of the things that you want to create in this platform. I think what's really nice is that whenever you might need it, it gives you the option to create it. Okay, so if you're creating this grade item, it gives you the option to create the rubric alongside here. So you don't have to create it somewhere else and then come back and edit it. You can create it all at the same, in the same process. Okay, so display options. Again, these are, this is what the students will view. Okay, so I can show students the average, you know, within that item, and category to users. I can also change what I see. So I want to see the grade color too, because that seems pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and save and close here. So we have, did this get associated with my category? I don't think it did. Let me make sure I put that in my category here. I don't think I did that. So, okay, so now we see it's kind of nested underneath my policy on essay. So do you think I should create that as an assignment and then link it to this gradebook?
You could,
Okay.
yeah.
So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go back to my course admin. So again, you're seeing a course that I haven't even opened before this time. So I'm going to jump into course builder here. And this is again where it's a really nice place to get a course outline documented or, you know, structured in your course. So over here are different placeholders that you can put in here, and then you can add content into those placeholders. So I'm going to add a module here, and this module is going to be all about my essay. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly create it. Okay. I'm going to add an assignment, which is one of, down here, okay, in this menu here. So I'm going to,
but you to create it first. Well, try it. I don't think I can. No, so you have to have it created. You could create a placeholder for it, but you may want to go to course admin and then assignments.
Okay, sorry, I missed a step here. So course admin assignments, I'm going to create that topic assignment that I had created a grade item for in the gradebook.
Choose a grade category where it goes. You should be able to, well, apparently it didn't create it.
Okay.
So add it to the category and then you can clean that up.
Yeah, so when you're creating an assignment to link it to your gradebook, you know, you're creating your assignment in this window, selecting your grade category here. 5 points, though I, you know, kind of wanted that pass-fail option, so I'm not sure why.
It looks like that's if it's a standalone thing. The better, the more typical practice is you create the assignments and then do the linkage. So you create the assignments, quizzes, and so forth and link to it. It's possible to set it up in advance, but probably the easiest thing to do is to set up the categories for your gradebook, then create the items and link it to the categories after. In theory, you can do the other, and for some things you could, but I don't know. I haven't played around with that enough. I've created the categories and then linked them.
Actually not going to change any of the availability dates because I want this available to them right at the beginning of the semester, throughout the entire semester. So I'm not going to change the availability dates. I'm also not going to really edit the submission and completion. You know, I want it to be a file submission, and that's default. I am going to allow them to allow unlimited files. I'm not going to have any restrictions on the file extensions. Actually, no, I am. I'm going to require it to be an annotatable file. That way I can make comments on their file submission without any issues with.
And for those who
format.
weren't here last time, that would include most standard document types, most standard spreadsheet types, most standard image types.
Always use this question mark to get more information on what these categories mean. I don't really need a notification email, so I'm not going to go ahead and do that. I don't have a rubric at the moment. I can always add it later. So with that, I'm going to save and close. Here's my assignments in my sort of placeholder module. So I'm going to go back to course admin, go back to grades, to manage grades. And see, it got linked correctly. Why I couldn't get this one to, I'm not sure exactly why that was the case, but I'm going to go to bulk edit here.
Select the first one.
And I'm going to select this one and I'm going to delete it. Now, if I wanted to change, all of the names of these to be more consistent, you know, I could select these in bulk edit here. So I could maybe say annotations 401, right? Policy on essay 401. This is the section of the course topic for 401. You know, this is, you know, just a really easy, quick way to edit your grade book without having to, you know, go into each individual item and make edits there.
I think if we want to see something with a few more items, we could probably hop over to my class for just a second. We'll just minimize this. It'll still be there, I think. And if we go to my course, we can look at least the manage, let me go to the actual, the current course that's underway. We won't look at any of the actual grades, but we could at least look at the manage grade book. So just to see what it looks like when you have a more filled out course. So we're going to go to course tools and we're going to go to course admin again, which is where you tend to go nearly all the time. And we're going to go to grades. And I'm hoping that will allow us not to see any grades. If not, if it does, we'll cut over. We're going to look at manage grades. Oh, and there's now a mistake. And it's because something came in. One of the things that happens is if you're using something, we'll see. You notice how there's a nice structure here. There's 3 weeks of work, and there should be actually 3 of these here, but there is not. So this will happen if you're using publisher's materials because it will not come into the category until you put it there. And the same will be true if you're using iClick or other things, but it's really easy to fix. So these are the smart book assignments, which are essentially adaptive learning grades they're receiving from the publisher's material, which is a textbook. There's a bunch of assignments in here, and apparently this did not go into the right category of quizzes, so I will have to fix that. And I think I should be able to fix that and assign that as a quiz. That's not the problem here. Right. Well, I'm not sure why that came in that way. I'll take a look at that. I must have done it with a different structure. Let me go back to the, let me get out of there. We'll save and close that. I'll look at that later to see why it doesn't show up as a quiz, because I thought I used a quiz tool for it. Save and close. There we go. So now the reason why that didn't show up, these are all assignments that are actually where they belong. The midterm exam is there. There's a separate category for the final. These are this one is not going to be used. I have to delete that when I change the first quiz. The final had 2 parts in it. There's a long story for that. Then I have my discussions. I have 2 weekly discussions. And you notice how nice and neat these all look, where everything's organized by category. And this is the problem. That category is worth 10 points or 20 points, but it belongs here in the smart book assignments. And that's something every week that just came due on Monday. You just need to put it here, which is 10% of the grade, save and close. And now that error message will go away. And you will get that whenever there's a grade coming in from an LTI integration, if it's not set up to automatically go in a category. And the issue is the publishers don't know when they transmit that information electronically where it's going to fit in the gradebook, at least not at this stage with the integrations they have set up. So that's what it looks like. And you notice I have the grades evenly distributed. So each one is a third of the grade for that category. These were all 20 points assignments. These were all, that one apparently it was a mistake. It was weighted a little more heavily, and so forth. So that's what it looks like once you get a bit for when you have more things. The difference is Maggie's class starts next week. Mine is now beginning its third week of the semester, or fourth week of the semester.
Well, that class I was just in was my fall semester course, so it'll be.
Originally it was in Maggie's case.
Yeah, like I created the pass fail option, and it was not giving me that option to make it pass fail in that when I went through the other direction. So I'm not sure why that was.
It looked like when we were looking at it, it did not have the types of options you'd have for an assignment you created. I think you would only create the item if it was a standalone item. So if you were using it for a face-to-face class and students were submitting it as a paper they do or a presentation they do, or if you have something coming in as a Google survey or a Google quiz or a Google assignment, then you might have to create it that way if we don't have the integration working. And so with standalone assignments, it's just a type of letter grade you could assign, which could be points or pass fail or letter grade where you choose one, rather than a score that's being graded for an item in here. Because I didn't see an option that would connect it.
Yeah, it didn't give me that option. So maybe there's something more, that we have here, but don't have any weighted grades, then I should just create items and not categories. I guess it depends. Categories can just be there to, keep everything organized in your grade book. But if you aren't weighting categories differently,
if
I'm not sure. A point-based system, then you wouldn't necessarily need them.
That's how students are doing and understanding and using TUL. One thing I can say, this was a direct message from someone here. One thing that I did in my first weekly discussion, I have a discussion, one of the discussion forums is where they share how they're doing, strategies to be effective in the course and so forth. And I asked them what their concerns were. And a significant number of students said a major concern they had was moving into a new learning management system when they're used to Blackboard. These are mostly juniors and seniors this summer. And so those were posted as their initial post, but as they started replying to each other, they said, well, I was a little concerned about this, but I find it's really not very difficult, that it's a lot easier to use in Blackboard. It's a lot more intuitive, and it has a lot of new features. And the things that they liked the most, one of the things they liked the most was the calendar reminders they got, where it tells them right as they log into the course. And also they like the checklist where it shows them exactly when everything is due and they can check it off when they completed it. And one thing that I've noticed is I've got a much higher completion rate. In online classes, people are much more likely not to do some of the work. And so far, I only have one student who missed this work in the second week. Haven't checked the week work in the third week yet. But I did have two people who didn't do some of the work the first week, but it's a much higher completion rate than I've ever seen in online class before. And I think a lot of it is because of the reminders.
Any other questions or anything else that you wanted to
Yeah, or if you're trying to set up a grade book and you'd like to ask some questions about it, I think the first thing to do would be to set up the categories and then to create the individual items, the assignments, the quizzes, the discussions, and so forth. And the more you can do that before the class, the easier it will be.
Yeah.
If we hop over to my class, we could take a look at the discussions, say, to show how they're connected, because that would not involve student work. So let's go back to the course builder. And again, this is where you go for pretty much everything. I know some institutions have disabled everything on the menu and just made course tools the course admin, because everything below it is available on the next page anyway, and it's all in one place. So we're going to go to discussions just to show as an example of how to connect. You've already done that, but just one more example. So we're going to go down to discussions here, and it will group them by well, this is something we talked about when we went through this yesterday. One difference that we should mention, just to make this a little bit clearer, is that in Brightspace, you have discussion forums and you have discussion topics. The forums are essentially a grouping in which there could be multiple topics. What we think of as discussion forums in Blackboard or Angel are now topics, but all the topics fit within a forum. So for example, what I have in here is two discussion forums. One is a metacognitive cafe. The other is just a content discussion. So you can set up the forum, and then each week I have an instance of both of those, which is the topic for the week in each category. It's just like the categories in gradebook with assignments and so forth. Within discussions, I have these two forums with individual topics. You could have, for example, a bulletin board or a coffee cooler discussion forum that occurs every week where people, or Q&A discussion forum, and you could just have different instances of it. Each instance would be one topic that would be active at that time. But what I wanted to do is just pick one of these. So this was, oops, I didn't mean to show the grade. Let's go through the settings of this, or the name of the students. There's no grade, but we can edit the topic. And when we edit the topic, the way in which you connect it, and this is true in all the gradable items that you create within here, is you basically pick the grade item, and this is the first instance of it. You could change it. I'm not going to change it because this one's always there. The number of points for it, you can add the rubric. The rubric is right here. And this is something that students can see. So they get to see what the grade is, and it's out of 100 possible points, just the way it was set up in here. And that's basically all you have to do once you create it. If you don't have a grade item for it, you would click new grade item, give it a name, give it the number of points, connect a rubric to it, make the rubric visible to students, which they are by default, and then just click save and close, and that's it. So when you start this, and when you start building, build the categories, and then as you build your assessments, connect those assessments back to the grade book as you build them. That's probably the cleanest workflow. Workflow.
Now, does anyone have any questions? Are you working through some of this on your own? Want to share your screen?
Yeah, we can stop our share.
What you're doing?
I have a quick question.
Go for it.
So I'm going to be doing assignments on paper in class, right? And then I want to put them in the grade book. That's going to be a manual operation, correct? Yes.
And it would be just the way Maggie created that one assignment there. So we can do that.
Let me share my screen again. Right. So if you were to do that.
Well, it would be, well, you can do it either way.
Yeah, so you can do it as an assignment. Like I said, there's many ways that you can, get to this. But you can do a new assignment. And if you said that, this particular submission was going to be observed in person, right? Mm-hmm. Is that the idea? Mm-hmm. You can mark as completed on the due date. If you are putting a due date, you can add points. You would, put this, or, keep this option here, right, in the grade book. If it's out of 25 points, save and close. Oh, is it gonna let me do that? Even though yeah, it is. I was like, I didn't put a name on it. Let me do it.
Yeah, you probably don't want to have too many untitled items. Right.
Right. So you can kind of go back to that grade book there, and you'll see
the names and stuff. Okay, and then I can enter it. Got it.
See that here. And you can, edit it within here if you wanted to move it to a different category. And again, if you wanted to, if you go back to the assignment, you can add a rubric there.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Well, people have their hands raised, so if they want to unmute and chime in.
Well, yeah, we can stop the share too, maybe just.
Dennis, go for it.
Okay, so discussions come in as forums, or do they come in as topics? And then the follow-up to that.
They come in as topics from the student view. The forums are basically a collection of topics, and there's two ways of doing that. One strategy that many people do use to keep it simple is each discussion, if you create a discussion topic, you can automatically create a discussion forum with the same name. And when you import things from Blackboard, that is, I believe, the default. So what will happen is you will have one discussion forum for each of your all discussions, and there will be a discussion topic under it. So it's basically a hierarchy where each item consists of, each forum consists of a single topic. In terms of structure, if you have multiple discussions, you could do that. Another way of doing it, for example, though, is if you want to give students some choice, if you want to use a UDL approach and you want to give students in a given course module, let's say 2 or 3 topics as possible, where they're only going to participate in one, you could give them 3 issues they could discuss and they pick one of those. So the discussion forum could be module 1 discussion, and then you could have topic 1, topic 2, and topic 3, and let students pick which one they choose. So what would happen is there would be 3 gradebook items in that category, and you can choose for the category to only take the highest grade among those. So that way students could pick what topic they want to discuss in that module.
Okay, you're killing me.
I guess more flexible.
I want to figure out is just a way to clean it up, because I'm just not going to be able to get to everything by fall even. So I'm just trying to choose my battles in between the assignments and the discussion, to which I can work with what I have now. And yeah, I can create, and start from the hierarchy, but that means rebuilding the class within the existing class, and I may not get to it all.
All of your discussion forums would come in from Blackboard.
I just have to tie them to the grades, the grade book.
Oh, they will come in a grade book with one forum and topic linked together, if I remember correctly. It's just a question of whether you want to keep that organization now that you have options to provide more structure. And in fact, when you create a discussion forum, let's click on new discussion. One of the things you have, pick a new forum. If you wanted to create a brand new one, you notice that radio button right below there, a checkbox, that if you choose create a new topic with the same title, it will create both the forum and the topic. So it'll be just like you were working in Blackboard.
Okay, I guess one of the things I have is, I don't mean to take everyone's time, but is creating a category where I could put all my discussions in. It's just a very simple model, so that any discussion gets 20% of the grade, and under the category of discussions, whereas journals or assignments would be another 20%. So I just try to figure out how I could just organize all the discussions so that they filter into that weighted grade.
So what you would do then is you would discuss a discussion, you would create in the gradebook a discussion category.
Right.
And then each of your discussion topics would be connected to a specific item in that gradebook category, just like before.
Because topics, goes to the grade, not forums. Right.
And they fit into categories. And if you have multiple discussion forums, as I did, for example, that Metacognitive Cafe is 5% of the grade. The other one, I think, is 15% of the grade. So what happens is you could have different weights for different types of discussion if you chose to do that.
Thanks.
Yeah, basically the topics are what are the items in the category. What we normally thought of as discussion forums are now called topics.
So this is just, kind of an example of what the structure looks like, right? This is the topic within it. This is the forum title.
No, we can't see that though.
Oh, sorry. I realized I'm not sharing the screen. Okay. All right, so this is what, a forum looks like. So this is the forum title. I just clicked that checkbox that asked if I wanted a topic with the same name to be created. And so I did. So I have a separate topic within here. I can add, I can add a new topic within here. So this is, forum example, or I wanted to stay within that first one. So we'll say example 2 in forum 1 here. We'll just go ahead and save and close.
Now, a really simple strategy is to discuss one forum, which you call discussions. And then each topic would be the old discussion forum, all in that category. And that could all map into a discussion category in the gradebook. And one nice feature of that is if you don't have that duplication as you have where it comes in as the same topic and forum named, by doing it, by having a forum, which is a catch-all category of, for example, just discussions, you can put some text in there with instructions on what you expect students to do. And you can have that appear as the introductory text in each of the discussion topics. So you don't have to duplicate instructions in each discussion topic that students work in.
Yeah. So when you do want to add your topics, right, to the gradebook, again, go into that, so this is, you're going to have to do it for each topic, right? So when you go into the topic, you go to assessment tab. You are going to create a new item here. So we're going to just call this discussion 1. And we're going to pick the category, the discussion category that I just created. So you can go through and assign all of those topics, right? You just have to go to edit topic to that assessment tab, and you can assign those all to that discussion category that you created in the gradebook. I think that will probably help, answer your question. So think of the forum and the topics as just an organizational tool. The topics are what's going to link to your gradebook, and you can define what category that links to through this assessment tab.
This is one area where it's a little bit different, but in practice, once you get used to it, it's no extra work on a part. It's just a little confusing because the structure is a little bit different.
Okay, so when something's coming and coming directly from Blackboard, you've mentioned that it comes as the forum and a topic. So if we just go to the topic, edit that topic. So this is in the second forum, right? I'm going to go to assessment. I'm going to, be able to make it a new grade item, but I'm going to pick that discussion category. So even things in different forums can go to that same gradebook category. Hope that helps.
If you're just going to have, say, a series of discussions and not on different topics, the simplest thing is probably to create one discussion category and edit your discussions so they're the topics, so they're all part of that. And then it's a nice cleaner look. So you have the category and then you have the discussions underneath that.
So you can see, just in my discussion forum here, only 2 of them, right, includes an assessment. So those are the only 2 that are linked to the gradebook. So if this was going to be, you know, just an introduction that was ungraded or something to that effect. You know, I just don't have that linked in the gradebook for an assessment right now.
It doesn't seem like you can edit the categories in the gradebook the way you did in Blackboard, where there was a separate column, I think, and you just chevron that and then could move it into a different category. I was trying to see if when you scrolled over before, whether there was an area where you could move things in and out of different categories, but
you can on the individual items. So for example, I think if you edit one of those,
move it, you know, out of there, you can make it, you know, put it into no category, or
okay,
you can change the there. You know, it'd be nice if you could like drag and drop it out. I don't believe you can.
I don't think you can. Not at this level. With the course builder, you can if you're moving items, but not in the gradebook.
So if you go to that bulk edit, right, and you have, you know, let's say all of these grade items here, okay, but you forgot, oh wait, I wanted this one, you know, to, well, there's no item for it right now, but right, this one's not in a particular category. So I could add this, I think, what is that? Oh, that's my untitled one. I'm going to add that to discussion, even though it's not really a discussion, right? So you can change, you know, all of these kind of easily.
So if you accidentally assigned it to the wrong one, you can change it here or by editing the category directly in the Manage Grade tool.
But this is nice because it does let you, you know, change things, you know, across the whole pretty quickly. Any other questions? Still not at my 100% here, but that's why we're building.
Once you get used to it, I think it's going to be more intuitive than the Blackboard gradebook. You know, I've been using for just a couple weeks now, and it's pretty intuitive, which is something I never said about the Blackboard gradebook.
So I think, you know, some of the key things is using this setup wizard, you know, to define the broad characteristics of your gradebook. And you can always go back in there and make edits, you know, as you please. And then, you know, really when you go into this Manage Grades tab and using these categories, so that way when you're building your course and building those assignments, you know, in your course admin, course builder, or wherever you're creating those assignments, you have those categories already created that you can link to. You certainly can make those edits within this area as well, but I think the easiest way to facilitate, you know, grouping similar assignments together is to create the categories before.
Those are the first things that students would generally see on the syllabus, that this item is worth a given percentage of the grade. Basically, you just build that into your gradebook initially, and then just add items to the category as they're done or as they complete them.
So I have a quick question. It's Julie again. Sorry, I've been out of the classroom for a couple of years. Do you have to know, let's say I know for example, I have a quiz category, right? So I set the quiz category up and maybe it's 40% of the grade or something like that. Do I have to know exactly how many quizzes I'm going to be giving over the semester?
Oh, and if you could choose to either treat all of the items equally and it will just take an average and that will be the category grade for the quizzes, or you could choose based on the number of points. So if you have some items that are 10-point quizzes and others that are 20-point quizzes, the 20-point quizzes would count more. And that's right at the option for the category that Maggie's displaying.
Yeah, so, you know, I'm just going to create a quizzes category. You know, if you want to distribute the weight evenly across all items, but you want to drop you know, the lowest 2 quizzes, right? You can do that
Perfect.
here.
Yeah.
And then, you know, save and close. This is just to create that category. So then when you go to create your quizzes in your course tools, course admin, you know, area, you can just link that to that category.
Got it.
And now nothing's in here, so.
Okay, thank you.
And one in cases, if you want to treat each quiz equally, as you often would with quizzes, you just use that, you know, treat them all equally in computing it. But you might want to use points if you had let's say, a long-term scaffolded assignment. For example, I think Maggie and I both use some assignments where students will do parts early on where they get some points for creating a proposal, they get some points for putting together a bibliography, and then some points for an annotated bibliography, some points for a first draft, and so forth. And what you may want to do to let students make mistakes without them being very costly is have relatively low points early on for the early stages and for the drafts, and then put more weight on the final product. So that way they've gotten feedback that really doesn't count that much, but they get some points for it. And then when they get to the final stage, after they've gotten all the feedback, you can weight that more heavily. And in that case, you just use more points for the items towards the end that you want to count more heavily. You know, so I just had my students do a big project where I think the final item they did was 150 points. The second draft of it, because they did this in multiple stages, was, I think, 80 points or 90 points. An earlier rough draft of it was worth 30 points and so forth. So it gradually counts more and more after they've had a chance to polish it, get feedback from me, feedback from peer review, and so forth. So you can have things where you count some stages of the project, typically the later stages, more than the earlier stages after students have had a chance to try things and get feedback. Other questions? So this is another way where you could create a standalone grade. Go right in the gradebook and create that column.
And you can always, you know, when you go to enter in grades, it'll show you all of these columns, and you can, for anything that's, that is a standalone item within the gradebook, you can manually enter in the grades.
However, a better way of doing it is a quick eval column. It's just it's a nicer interface.
I don't want to.
I have tried both of those, and the quick eval is just a cleaner interface. It's easier to miss grades if you go into the intergrades option. It's not that much different than it would be to integrate directly in Blackboard or to grade things, discussions or essays and so forth.
Any other questions or anything you're working on?
You know, when I first started, the distinction between topics and discussion forums seemed baffling until I actually decided what the structure would be. Once I did, it came across really simply. It's just very different. You should have access to your courses right now. You can export your Blackboard course, import it in, and then work on it. So you've got as much time as you can find this summer, allowing time for lots of rest and relaxation after a really, really rough year. You know, this was not ideally timed, but the planning for this went back about 4 or 5 years, and it was long before the pandemic. You know, it's perhaps one of the only time that could have been worse if we had to make this transition in the summer of 2020. You know, we all need a bit of a break, so make sure you take a break, but, you know, work on this gradually. It'll come together. I only had about a week to build my course, and I'm building it week by week, and it's a little bit of a challenge, but the more you do it, it becomes really intuitive. And I'm much more comfortable now working in Brightspace than I ever was in Blackboard.
Just one more thing is stuff that's coming in from Blackboard won't be. See, I'm afraid of missing something that's been put in there that's a graded item. So I don't think anything is in the grade book until you put it there. That comes from Blackboard.
Some of the things came from Blackboard and went into the gradebook correctly. Some of it didn't come in as correctly, and I've heard that from other people too. But all you have to do is edit it and assign it into the gradebook.
Yeah.
And it just, when you edit the item, you get a tab called assessment, and just make sure it's going into the right category. And then it'll be fine. So all of the materials will come in. There's only one thing, and I had about 230 or 40 individual files in my Blackboard course that ported over. I've only found one thing that did not port correctly, and it was alt text for a complicated graph. Apparently, the alt text limitation on the number of characters is shorter in Brightspace than it was in Blackboard. So what happened is the graph did not come over. I had to go into Blackboard, grab the graph, and write a shorter alt text to describe what was happening in the graph. But otherwise, every single thing came over perfectly. The only reformat that I've done is to make it look nicer, because the Brightspace defaults are a lot nicer than the Blackboard ones. And you know, they use a nice accessible font. They use a more responsive font size. And basically, if you just match the font and the font size to what they use in the templates, which are Lato, L-A-T-O, and it will say default if you choose a font. Yeah. And if you choose 19 points, it's a nice big font that's very readable on mobile devices. And this whole system was built so that it works really well on mobile devices, which was never true on Blackboard. That a lot of the assessments, quizzes, and so forth were horrible when students tried to do it in the Blackboard app. These work really well from everything I've heard. And you know, we have more and more students who are interacting in their courses and taking quizzes and so forth on mobile devices. And this works much more effectively and cleanly on that than Blackboard ever did. Other questions? Well, the instructional designers will be holding regular office hours, I think, beginning today, this afternoon. And beginning next week, there's going to be some time in the library with coffee and snacks, I think, provided by the provost office.
Migration and Munchies is what it's called.
Migration and Munchies, which may have something to do with decriminalization. Oh, no, that's in any case, that's going to start, I think, next week, I believe. But you'll be hearing more from our instructional designers and the transition team on that, where basically people are encouraged to go upstairs in the library, have some coffee or tea and some snacks, and to work together on this, where there'll be at least one instructional designer there to provide assistance to anyone who needs it. And it'll be a nice chance to work together with other people and chat over things and go through any questions you might have. So, and if you haven't done so, work through those asynchronous modules that come over. They're really well done. And, you know, besides what you can learn from the content, the way they're structured is a really nice example of how to build an effective course. And the scaled webinars that SUNY has been offering have also been really effective. So. So yeah, there will be some help available all summer, and I know the instructional designers are planning to do some work in August to support new faculty as well as anyone who needs some additional support. Yeah, there's a couple of questions about earlier workshops. I've shared on almost a daily basis after the workshops a link to YouTube videos. One of the things we did in the week before CIT here was a workshop on porting your content. Basically, you export it from Blackboard, you import it in here, and everything gets picked up really really well. It's a much better conversion than the Angel to Blackboard conversion was. It's not the recording.